The candles on my parents' dining table were still flickering when Brian leaned back in his chair, lifted his wine glass, and pointed it at me like he was delivering a punchline. The room smelled of roasted beef and too sweet champagne, but all I could taste was the metallic edge of silence that followed his voice. "Some people bloom late," he said with a lazy smile, "and some never bloom at all." The laughter that burst around me felt rehearsed, sharp enough to make the air hum. My mother covered her mouth dramatically, my father chuckled into his napkin, and Emily perfect polished. Emily hid her grin behind her hand like she was embarrassed for me, not by him. Brian kept smiling, waiting for me to crumble. I didn't. I just lowered my fork, letting the soft clink echo louder than the laughter. The heat from the candles stretched between us, and in that moment I knew something was about to snap. Not in him, in me. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Alyssa Morgan. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who never made waves because waves in my family weren't allowed. I live in a tiny apartment a few miles from the river, spend my mornings freelancing as a software developer, and my evenings trying not to let the silence of my phone bother me. People say independence builds character, but in my case it was survival, because the house I grew up in didn't leave much room for anyone who didn't fit the picture. My mother Linda has always cared more about what people saw than what was true. Every room in our home was staged like it was waiting for a magazine photographer to walk through the door. My father Charles didn't argue with her. He simply agreed with whoever spoke the loudest. And my sister Emily, she learned early that being the shining daughter came with applause. Whenever she stumbled, Mom called it graceful. Whenever I excelled, Mom asked if I was trying to outdo my sister. I grew up learning how to step aside, how to shrink myself small enough to keep peace in a family that mistook silence for respect. When Emily divorced last year, Mom unraveled like a loose thread, desperate to stitch our image back together. Then Brian showed up, smooth-talking, confident, always performing, as though the spotlight followed him from room to room. He talked about finance like he was the only man on Wall Street keeping the market afloat, and my parents soaked up every word. Suddenly, Emily had a future again, and I became part of the background the way I always had been. I knew I was being summoned when Mom texted about Sunday dinner. She didn't ask if I could come, she told me to. That's how it always worked. Her messages weren't invitations, they were reminders of my place. When I walked into their house that night, the aroma of lemon polish and expensive candles hit me first, followed by Mom's clipped greeting. "Alyssa, sweetheart, you're late." I looked at the clock. I was 2 minutes early. But in my family, being on time meant being obedient, and being obedient meant surrendering the moment you walked through the door. The dining room looked like a rehearsal dinner for a wedding that hadn't happened yet. Gold-rimmed plates, perfectly folded cloth napkins, wine already waiting in crystal glasses. And there he was, Brian Carter, sitting in the chair that used to belong to my grandfather, one arm draped over Emily's seat, as though he'd already inherited the entire family. He grinned at me like he'd rehearsed it. "Alyssa, you made it. Thought you might bail." "Tough night coding your dreams again." Emily giggled, not because it was funny, but because it was expected. I took my seat. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I'd learned long ago that in this family defending myself only made me the problem. So I stayed quiet as the conversation drifted from weather to weddings to all the ways Emily was thriving. Brian chimed in with exaggerated stories about his office stories, where he was always the hero, always the genius, always the one generous enough to tolerate people beneath him. And each time he glanced at me, the smirk grew sharper, as if he was daring me to object. The first real cut came when he leaned back, swirling his wine, and said loudly enough for every fork to pause. Not that Alyssa would know anything about real finance. She's still figuring things out. My mother laughed too quickly, like she wanted the neighbors to hear it through the walls. Dad nodded like it was a fact. Emily touched Brian's arm in mock scolding, but smiled through the whole performance. Something shifted inside me. Then, not rage, not hurt, something colder. Recognition. This wasn't teasing. This was a script they'd all agreed to, one where I was the convenient target, the safe one to laugh at. I'd played that role my entire life. But sitting there in the warm glow of those candles, listening to Brian's voice slice through me, while my family applauded the cruelty, I felt the first tremor of a truth I hadn't let myself acknowledge. This time, I wasn't going to stay quiet. And none of them, not my sister, not my parents, and certainly not Brian, had any idea what I had brought with me that night. I was 11 the first time I realized my place in the family. It was the afternoon of Emily's middle school awards ceremony, the kind of spring day when the Texas sun hangs heavy over everything. I remember sitting in the packed gym, my feet dangling above the floor, clutching a handmade card I'd spent all morning drawing. Emily was getting another trophy that day, Best All-Around Student, and Mom wanted a perfect picture of her two daughters together afterward. But when the ceremony ended and the crowd spilled onto the lawn outside, it happened again. Mom bent down to fix Emily's hair, tucking a blonde curl behind her ear, then turned and said, "Alyssa, sweetheart, move a little to the side. You're blocking the light." I shuffled an inch, then another, feeling the card in my hand wilt with sweat. Dad lifted the camera. Mom wrapped an arm around Emily, and before I could step back closer, Mom said sharply, "Alyssa, just hold our things. We don't want clutter in the photo." She shoved her purse and Dad's jacket into my arms, and as I stood off to the left, the wind sticking the papers to my shirt, I watched them smile for a picture I wasn't in. Emily's trophy gleamed beneath the sun, and Mom kissed her forehead as though she'd been crowned queen. I stared at the card I'd made, uneven edges, crooked stars, and quietly folded it in half, then in half again until it disappeared in my pocket. Some memories blur over time. Not that one. It still comes back as sharply as the click of that camera. And even now I can still hear Mom's voice saying, "Perfect. Absolutely perfect." The flash of that day still lingers even decades later, like the memory has its own pulse. When I came back to myself that night at the dinner table with Brian's laughter echoing around me, I realized I had been here before, just older, alone, and holding a different kind of weight. The years between that childhood moment and now felt like a long hallway lined with small, carefully disguised wounds. Growing up in the Morgan house meant learning how to take up less space. My mother didn't need to say it outright. It was stitched into our routines. Emily's ballet recitals filled entire weekends. Her pageant rehearsals took over evenings. Her school projects were displayed on the living room mantel, like priceless art. My achievements were, according to Mom's suite, unnecessary, or things we don't need to make a fuss about. By 13, I instinctively stepped aside when a spotlight appeared, even if it wasn't meant for Emily. By 16, I stopped telling my parents when I made the honor roll because it felt like bragging. By 18, I learned to clear my own path quietly, the way someone learns to walk around furniture in the dark without turning on the light. Mom always insisted she loved us equally, but love in our house was measured by how well you fit the picture she curated. Emily fit effortlessly. Everything about her, from her glimmering smile to her confident posture, matched Mom's expectations of what a daughter should be. I was different. Not difficult, not rebellious, just different. Too quiet, too observant, too willing to ask why things had to be the way they were. And in a family built on appearance, questions were unwelcome. Dad didn't help. He wasn't unkind. He was simply never there in the ways that mattered. He worked long hours, came home tired, and avoided conflict the way someone avoids thunderstorms. If Mom was the wind that shaped the household, Dad was the still water beneath it, not harmful but never a force that pushed back. When Emily and I argued, he rarely took a side. When Emily got her way again and again, he chalked it up to her being older, being more responsible, being whatever excuse sounded reasonable at the time. The truth was simple. Emily didn't have to earn their approval. She already had it. I spent years trying to catch up without knowing I was running a race I was never meant to win. Holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving turned into a stage show with Mom directing the entire family. Emily, wearing a dress Mom picked, would sit at the table like the guest of honor while I moved dishes around the kitchen because your hands are better suited for details. Christmas follows the same script. Emily opened her gifts in full view so Mom could record every moment. My presents were handed to me quietly, usually practical things like notebooks or sweaters. items meant to be useful rather than celebrated. I didn't resent Emily as a child. She wasn't malicious. She simply grew up believing the house revolved around her. Kids accept the world as it is. I accepted mine too. But there was one memory, a much later one, that shaped the silence I carried into adulthood. It was the summer before I left for college. I'd been accepted into a competitive program, the first in our family to earn a scholarship like that. I came home from orientation buzzing with excitement, ready to share the news. But when I walked through the door, Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table with Emily, who looked nervous and fragile. She announced she had been accepted as a finalist for a regional pageant competition, something she'd been chasing for years. Mom's eyes filled with tears of joy. Dad hugged her. Then Emily turned to me and said, "I hope it's okay, but we're planning the whole summer around the pageant prep." Mom chimed in, "We'll need to put your college ceremony photos on pause. Emily's event is the week before, and I want her to feel our full support." I stood there holding the orientation packet filled with details about my major dorm schedule and financial aid. I waited for one of them to say something, anything about my achievement. Mom didn't look at the packet once. Dad nodded politely without asking a single question. "Of course," I heard myself say. "It's totally fine." It wasn't. I knew even then it wasn't. But I'd learned to swallow disappointment before the words formed. I folded the packet in half and placed it quietly on the counter, the same way I'd folded that handmade card years before. That night I cried for the first time in years, silent small tears that dried on my pillow before anyone noticed. As I got older, I stopped trying to prove myself. I stopped asking for their attention. I built a world where expectations were low, and solitude felt safer than being overlooked in a room full of family. I studied computer science, graduated, and carved out a quiet career that wasn't flashy but was mine. I paid my own bills, learned to fix my own mistakes, and stopped waiting for applause that would never come. Still, the weight of those years settled deep inside me, shaping the way I reacted to everything, including men like Brian. I recognized his type the moment he walked into the family. Men who talked big, laughed loud, and filled every space with their ego. Men who expected approval without earning it. Men who believed being the center of attention meant they belonged everywhere. When my parents embraced him instantly, I wasn't surprised. He mirrored everything they admired, charm, confidence, a veneer of success. The more he talked, the more he reminded me of all the moments when I'd been small on purpose so others could shine. And the more he mocked me, the more I felt old wounds stirring beneath the surface. Sitting at that dinner table, hearing him joke about my career and belittle my work in front of my parents and sister wasn't just hurtful. It was familiar. The laughter that bubbled around him felt like the same laughter that followed me my entire childhood. The same dismissal, the same erasure, the same expectation that I should smile and take the blow without flinching. But something had shifted in me long before that dinner. Maybe it began the day I realized I didn't need their approval to build a life. Maybe it started the night I moved into my own apartment and felt the freedom of a door that closed gently without judgment. Or maybe the seed had been planted much earlier, back when I stood holding Mom's purse in the sun while she took a family picture without me in it. Whatever the reason, I walked into that dinner with a different kind of resolve. I wasn't there to argue with Brian. I wasn't there to win over my parents. I wasn't even there to defend myself. I was there because I'd spent the past week learning something about him, something that made every insult he threw land differently. Something that made every sneer feel like fuel rather than injury. Even before the dinner began, I knew the power dynamic wasn't what he thought it was. And as the night unfolded, as each cruel remark sharpened my focus, instead of shattering it, I felt the tension inside me gathering into something steady and unbreakable. Because deep in my purse, buzzing faintly against the lining, was the truth he never expected anyone to uncover. And in just a moment, one carefully chosen moment, it was going to change everything. The first sign something was wrong came late on a Tuesday night when an unfamiliar name appeared in my inbox, Carter Holdings verification notice. I stared at the subject line confused, then clicked. A PDF opened bank transfers, dozens of them, each transaction linked to a Nevada-based shell corporation I'd never heard of. Before I could process it, another email popped up, returned investment inquiry. Urgent. My pulse kicked up. I opened it and saw a desperate message from someone named Mark, asking when he could expect repayment for the guaranteed monthly return. Then a third email rolled in, this one, a voicemail transcription from a man threatening to report false promises if he didn't get his money back. I clicked play on the attached audio. The voice that answered wasn't a stranger's. It was Brian's smooth, cheerful, assuring the caller that their money was locked into a high-yield project. My hand went numb around the mouse. Another file opened automatically, a screen recording someone had sent me Brian on a video call, confidently promising a 25% monthly return as if the law didn't exist. My breath caught. All I could hear was the sound of his voice saying, "Guaranteed, absolutely risk-free." I didn't move. Not for a long moment. Then the shock hit. I remember leaning back in the chair, shutting my eyes, trying to slow the pounding in my chest. It felt like I'd stepped off a ledge without realizing there was no ground beneath me. What I had stumbled onto wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad investment. It was deliberate, structured, calculated. And the more I dug, the more horrifyingly clear it became. The first document I opened was a spreadsheet labeled Projected Yield Schedule, filled with fake numbers and fabricated returns. It had been updated weekly for months. Another tab laid out investor names, all casual acquaintances of Brian co-workers, gym friends, neighbors, people who trusted him, people who probably had no idea their money was evaporating. My stomach twisted. I clicked through more emails, lonely, worried messages the kind people send when they're afraid to admit they've been scammed. Their tone was gentle, assuming the best. No one accused him of anything yet. They were still hopeful, still trusting, still giving him the benefit of the doubt. I knew that feeling too well. Scrolling deeper, I found confirmation receipts for wire transfers, some small, a few enormous, each stamped with the name of the same Nevada corporation. Each one traced directly back to Brian. And every time he forwarded the documents to himself, he marked the emails private. One recording stopped me cold. He was talking to Emily. Not the version of Emily I knew, the polished, confident woman my parents adored. This Emily sounded hesitant, even scared. She asked him why he needed another loan. He told her it was for a private business trip, that men like him had to take big risks, and that once it all paid off, she'd be proud to be standing beside someone so visionary. I listened to that line twice, then a third time. The lie felt like smoke filling my lungs, thick, choking, poisonous. My first instinct was to close the laptop, to pretend I hadn't heard it, to let the truth wash past me like every other painful thing my family never wanted to face. But my hand wouldn't move. Instead, it hovered over the trackpad, trembling, because there was one detail tucked into that voicemail transcript that changed everything. The caller mentioned an address, a corporate suite belonging to a firm I knew, a firm where a close friend of mine worked, someone I trusted more than almost anyone. I messaged him immediately asking if he'd ever heard the name Carter Holdings. He responded within seconds. "That's not a real investment firm. Whoever's using that name is forging credentials." Then he added something else. "Make sure your family isn't involved. Stuff like this blows up fast." I stared at his message until the words blurred. My family wasn't just involved. My sister was engaged to the man who created the entire operation, and my parents worshipped him. I closed the computer slowly, but the buzzing inside me didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more defined. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was recognition. This was the same feeling I'd had standing beside the trophy lawn years ago. The same feeling I'd had folding my college orientation packet in half. The same feeling that had shadowed me through every holiday and every dinner table. The knowledge that the truth, no matter how clear, would always be dismissed if acknowledging it meant imperfection. My family had never wanted honesty. But this time, the truth wasn't something that could be swallowed or ignored. Brian wasn't just cruel. He wasn't just arrogant. He wasn't just another man who enjoyed talking down to someone who didn't fight back. He was dangerous. And Emily was too blinded by her need for love and validation to see it. The pieces started to fit together with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt. His expensive watch that mysteriously appeared one month. The business trips he'd taken to places that didn't match any major conference schedule. The checks he asked Emily to write for him because banks were slow. Even his overly confident stories about finance, now they sounded less like expertise and more like someone who knew how to lie with a straight face. What terrified me most wasn't how long he'd been running his scheme. It was how easily my family let him in. My parents loved polished confidence. They worshipped people who fit the image they wanted to project. And when Brian arrived tall and charming, dressed like he belonged in a boardroom, they didn't question a thing. No one asked what he actually did. Not really. Because asking would have required them to do something they never learned to do, look past appearances. I realized then that Emily wasn't just at risk of losing money or getting her heart broken. She was at risk of being dragged into something criminal. Something that would stain her life far more deeply than another failed engagement ever could. I had to tell her. But I also knew how that conversation would go. She'd defend him. She'd look at me with the same mix of pity and irritation I'd seen since childhood. She'd say I was jealous or anxious or misinformed. She would turn to Mom, and Mom would turn to Dad, and all three would reassure each other that Brian was trustworthy and I was simply overreacting again. I could practically hear Mom's voice in my head. "Alyssa, you always look for the negative. Let us enjoy something for once." They wouldn't believe me, not unless I had proof. And even then, they would look for excuses. I had seen it happen before in smaller ways, quieter ones, but always the same pattern. Mom insulated Emily from the truth whenever it threatened the family image. Dad followed her lead. Emily learned to align with whoever validated her most. And I learned to keep my discoveries to myself. But not this time. Not when it mattered. Still, a part of me hesitated. Not because I doubted the evidence, but because I understood exactly what exposing Brian would mean. It would mean tearing open years of denial. It would mean disrupting the perfect picture my mother lived for. It would mean being blamed yet again for causing trouble. And worst of all, it would mean risking my relationship with Emily completely. But the thought of her finding out the truth too late of her name, tied to fraudulent accounts of her being pulled into an investigation she knew nothing about, made my chest tighten with something close to panic. I wouldn't let that happen, even if she hated me for it, even if my parents turned on me, even if the entire family shattered under the weight of the truth. I returned to my laptop, reopened the files, and organized everything into a single folder. Emails, recordings, transaction logs, screenshots. I read through each one slowly, methodically, until the picture became undeniable. By the time I finished, the room was dark. The only light came from the glow of my screen, casting long shadows along the walls. I connected my phone and transferred everything to it. Not to weaponize it, not yet, but to keep it safe. As I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, another realization settled over me. This wasn't just about Brian. It was about my entire life. Every time I had stayed silent, every time I had been pushed aside, every time I'd chosen to fold myself smaller because stepping forward felt like a crime. The years of swallowing words and minimizing my own worth had built a kind of armor I didn't understand until now. Silence had shaped me. But the truth was about to change me. When the transfer finished, I unplugged my phone and held it in my hand. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than files, more than evidence. It carried the beginning of something irreversible. A quiet decision formed inside me, solid, unwavering. I would not stay silent at that dinner, and when the moment came when Brian looked at me with that smug, dismissive grin, certain he'd pinned me to the floor, that would be the moment everything turned. I wasn't going there to start a fight. I was going there to end one. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping sharply across the hardwood, and every conversation at the table died at once. The room went still, the kind of stillness that makes the air feel thick. Brian froze with his wineglass halfway to his lips. My mother's smile collapsed. My sister's hands trembled on her napkin. I laid my phone in the middle of the table, tapped the screen, and let the first audio clip play. Brian's own voice filled the room, smooth, confident, unmistakable. Guaranteed. Absolutely risk-free. The words echoed off the walls like a crack of thunder. Emily's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered onto her plate. My father's face went gray. Brian lurched forward, reaching for the phone, but I slid it just out of reach. "Sit down," I said. And somehow he did. You might wonder how we reached this moment, but the truth started unraveling long before anyone could see it. I'd spent days preparing. Not just collecting files, but organizing them, verifying them, learning exactly how each piece fit together. I printed some documents, stored others on my phone, even saved backups in case Brian tried to deny everything. I rehearsed what to say, rehearsed how to keep my voice steady, rehearsed how not to let years of swallowing my emotions spill out as rage. I carried that evidence with me into my parents' house like someone carrying a storm in a sealed jar, waiting for the exact moment to let it break open. And that moment came when Brian leaned back in his chair and asked Alyssa, "What do you even do all day besides code your feelings?" That was when everything inside me clicked into place. So when I stood up at the table, I wasn't acting on impulse. I was stepping into a plan. As the audio continued to play, the room around me seemed to shrink. Chairs, plates, candles, all of it receded, leaving only faces. My mother clutched her pearls as though the sound itself had reached across the table and grabbed her. My father stared at Brian as if he were seeing him clearly for the first time. Emily's lips parted, her breath jagged and uneven. Brian let out a shaky laugh. This isn't what it sounds like. But the audio rolled on, revealing every false promise he'd made to investors. My voice came out calm. Too calm. It sounds exactly like fraud. He whipped his head toward me. "You had no right to dig through my private files. You had no right dragging my sister into something criminal," I replied. This time he didn't laugh. My mother found her voice first thin and trembling. "Alyssa, turn that off. This isn't appropriate." I didn't look at her. "Appropriate. You're worried about etiquette while your future son-in-law is breaking federal law." Emily pressed her fist to her mouth. "Brian, please tell me this is fake." His jaw flexed. "It's complicated." The moment he said that, my father's hand struck the table so hard the wine glasses trembled. "Complicated. You told us you were starting a fund. You said you were licensed." Brian swallowed. "I am." "You're not," I cut in. "None of your credentials check out." Before he could respond, I tapped another file. This time the screen lit up with a document, one I hadn't planned to show so soon. A bank statement. Emily leaned forward. "What is that?" My stomach tightened. Because this was the twist I hadn't wanted to reveal tonight. But Brian forced my hand the moment he tried to dismiss everything as misunderstanding. I zoomed in on the signature line. Emily gasped. There, in sloppy blue ink, was her signature, or rather someone's attempt at it, authorizing a transfer of $9,000 to a Nevada corporation, a transfer she never made. "I never signed that," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of it. Brian's face drained of color. "Emily, listen. You forged my name," she screamed, surging to her feet. My mother jumped up too. "Emily, please lower your voice." "No," Emily snapped. "He forged my name. He stole my savings." "And you're worried about my voice." The whole room jolted at the sheer force of her words. But something in Brian broke then. Some veneer of charm he had been holding on to shattered. He stood up too quickly, knocking over his chair. "It's not what you think?" "It's exactly what I think," I said, quietly lifting another document, this one a wire transfer he'd made using an email address tied to Emily's tax records. Emily stared at it like it was a wound. "You used my identity," she whispered. Brian's hands shook. I was going to pay it back." "You stole from her," my father growled. "From my daughter." Brian stumbled backward, grasping for anything to soften the blow. "Your daughter," he spat. "She wasn't using the money. It was just sitting there. And Emily knows. She knows I'm building something. I'm doing this for us." Emily looked at him with a disgust so deep it seemed to pull the air out of the room. "You didn't do this for us. You did it because you thought I was too stupid to notice." Brian opened and closed his mouth like a trapped animal. "My mother usually so controlled," whispered Alyssa. "How long have you known I met her eyes?" "Long enough to know you wouldn't have listened." A tear slipped down her cheek, not for me, but for the perfect image she could no longer protect. Someone at the end of the table, maybe my father, exhaled a sound halfway between disbelief and pure trembling rage. Brian backed up another step, eyes darting as if measuring the distance to the door. "You're all blowing this out of proportion. It's not like I stole from strangers. You stole from everyone," I said. "But worst of all, you stole from her." Emily let out a sound I'd never heard before, a broken guttural cry, and threw her engagement ring across the table. It skidded across the wood and hit Brian squarely in the chest. "Get out!" she said, her voice shaking with fury. He looked around wildly, as if expecting someone, my mother perhaps, to defend him. But the room had shifted, permanently. No one spoke. No one moved toward him. For the first time all night, Brian realized he wasn't the center of anything. He was the collapse. He straightened his jacket with trembling hands. "You're all making a huge mistake." My father stepped forward, shoulders squared. "Son, if you don't walk out that door right now, I'll make sure the police escort you." Brian's expression twisted anger, panic, disbelief, all tangled together. He hissed something under his breath, then grabbed his coat and stumbled toward the front hall. His footsteps echoed like thunder in a house that had finally run out of illusions. The door slammed. Silence crashed into its place. Not the everyday silence of a family who avoids conflict. Not the careful quiet of years spent pretending. This silence was raw, exposed, and it belonged to us. Emily stared at the door for a long moment, her breath shaking. Then she sank into her chair and covered her face. My father bent over her, struggling to find words. My mother sat rigid pale, like the world she'd curated so carefully had crumbled in her hands. I stood there, the weight of everything finally settling. My father turned toward me slowly. "Alyssa, if you hadn't—" He stopped himself, voice cracking. My mother whispered something, but the words were too soft to catch. Whether it was a thank you or a plea or a question, I didn't know. I didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. The balance in that room had shifted permanently, unmistakably, irrevocably. And it wasn't Brian who made it happen. It was me. Without another word, I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. My hand brushed Emily's shoulder as I passed. She caught my wrist briefly, not to hold me back, but in silent understanding. I nodded. Then I walked toward the door. Behind me, the house remained frozen in the aftermath, my family standing among the wreckage of a truth they never expected and could never ignore again. I stepped outside into the cold night air, exhaling the breath I'd been holding for years. The confrontation was over, but what came next, the healing, the rebuilding, had only just begun. When I stepped outside that night, the cold air felt sharp enough to clear something inside me. The door closed behind me with a soft thud. No yelling, no footsteps chasing me, no final demand from my mother. Just silence. A clean, untouched silence that didn't follow the rules of the house I grew up in. I took my first breath slow and steady, and it filled my lungs differently. As though the path ahead had finally opened for me, not around me. I stood on the porch for a moment, watching the wind move through the trees, and I felt the shift settle deep in my chest. I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking toward myself. In the days that followed, the world didn't explode the way I expected. It simply softened. The edges grew quieter, the mornings felt calmer, and for once, my days were not shaped by bracing myself for someone else's disappointment. It was the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet, but I knew it had been waiting for me for a long time. The first change came from me reclaiming the space where I lived. My apartment had always been functional, but impersonal, a place to sleep and stay out of the way. Now it became something else. I spent a weekend clearing out old furniture, repainting the living room walls, a warm, easy shade of soft gray, opening the windows wide enough for sunlight to spill across the floor. With every stroke of the roller, with every bag I carried to the curb, something inside me loosened. I wasn't just cleaning, I was making room for new routines, new peace, a new version of myself that didn't shrink at the sound of someone else's voice. I went through old boxes I hadn't opened in years, college papers, half-finished coding projects, sketches from art classes I took when no one knew I was taking them. I found pieces of myself I'd tucked away because they hadn't fit into the world my parents wanted me to inhabit. I kept the things that still felt true. I let the rest go. There were moments, of course, when the quiet felt sharp instead of soft, when the absence of a text from my mother or father reminded me of the distance I'd created. But every time the ache crept in, I reminded myself that stepping away wasn't abandonment. It was survival. And survival, I was learning, could be gentle too. Emily reached out a few days after everything fell apart. She didn't call at first. She showed up at my door with swollen eyes and a trembling voice. When I let her in, she didn't sit. She wrapped her arms around me with a force that felt like apology and grief woven together. She stayed with me that night, curled on the couch under a blanket, speaking in slow, halting sentences about the pieces of her life she now had to gather. "I should have listened," she whispered. I brushed her hair from her face. "You saw what you needed to see when you were ready to see it." She cried then, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way someone cries when the truth finally fits into the space it belongs. I didn't try to fix it. I just stayed with her the way I had always wanted someone to stay with me. My parents, on the other hand, slipped into their familiar silence. A letter arrived about a week later, cream stationery gold, edging the kind my mother kept for Christmas cards. Inside was nothing but an empty folded sheet. No words, no apology, no acknowledgement. I stared at it for a long moment, then placed it gently in a drawer. Not out of hope, out of understanding. That was all they were capable of offering, and accepting that freed me more than any apology ever could. In the middle of all of this, something unexpected happened. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, people who had floated on the edges of my life stepped in quietly. A co-worker invited me to a small weekend brunch with her book club. A neighbor dropped off a plant for my newly repainted living room. A friend from college texted out of the blue saying something reminded her of me and asking if I wanted to catch up. Their gestures were small, but together they formed something steady. A reminder that family doesn't always come from the places we're told to expect it. Work shifted too. I took on a new project, something I'd been too hesitant to attempt before. A custom app designed to help small businesses track inventory. It was the kind of complex, detail-heavy project that made my brain feel awake again. I worked late into the evenings, not out of pressure, but because I wanted to. For the first time in years, I wasn't coding in the shadows of someone else's expectations. I was building something that reflected my own hands. One Sunday morning, as I opened the blinds and watched the sun spill across the room, I realized how different everything felt. My apartment wasn't just a place to live anymore. It was a reflection of who I was becoming. A few weeks later, I took a walk along the waterfront, something I hadn't done in far too long. The breeze carried salt and sunlight, the waves rolled against the pier, and the world around me hummed with a gentle, steady rhythm. I sat on a bench and watched the water glisten under the afternoon sky. For the first time in my adult life, I felt the quiet settle inside me without fear attached to it. Peace didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt earned. As the breeze lifted my hair and the day stretched open before me, I understood something simple. Healing wasn't a single moment or a dramatic transformation. It was the accumulation of small, honest choices. It was choosing to let go of a picture-perfect family that had never truly seen me. Choosing to build something of my own. Choosing to stay when people reached out in kindness. Choosing to leave when staying meant losing myself. I stood and walked toward the light glinting off the water, and a quiet truth settled in my chest, a truth I had spent years circling without ever touching. Strength isn't loud. It isn't a performance. It's the quiet resolve to choose yourself every single time. And for the first time in my life, that choice felt natural. It felt right. It felt like home.